So now that I'm moving on to my realism rose, my needle selection for a tattoo like this, I'm going to use my 10 gauge 3-round liner to make sure that all of the edges are nice and crisp. Even though this is more realistic and I'm not going to outline this the same way that I've done with the other rows, I'm still relying on my liner to keep everything really crisp and tight so that it doesn't blur and get faded and messy as the tattoo ages. Because it's realism, I want it to be nice and soft and I want to take my time. My voltage at the moment is set to 7.5. I might turn it down to 7 and work between 7 and 7.5. Stroke is down to 3.9. I don't want it all the way up to 4.2. 3.9 is still strong enough that it's going to be efficient, but it's going to be soft enough that I can actually take my time and not have to worry about overworking or rushing. This is the type of depth that I'm working with. I'm not going to be working with all of that needle, just the tip. And sometimes, depending on the different areas of skin that I'm working on, if I'm working on an area with some muscle and tissue underneath it, and I feel like I can rely on a little bit of pressure to help me, having the needle out a bit more isn't such a bad thing. If you feel like you're working over a bone and it's really easy to go too deep and you want to have a little bit more control, sometimes I might take the needle in just a little bit. But for now, I'm going to start with something like that. And I typically like to start with the darker bits so that I have all of the skin tone is there, and I want to get through a lot of the black and the 2/3 cap. All of my darker tones and shadows I like to go through first. I showed you this in the other rows that I did, just so that I can get a first layer down, I can keep it crisp, and I've got a clean method to work with. Once I've got my shadows done, you'll see how much easier it is to focus on my lighter shadows after that. You'll see with certain techniques like this, even though I'm not doing solid lines, I can still rely on some lines just to begin to open the skin and get familiar with where my needle is. Just begin to open the skin and start putting our shading down. Even though I'm using my liner here, I'm using it a bit more like a shader with my depth, with my rhythm and my technique. You can see that it's a little bit more of a pendulum style technique to my shading. The liner just helps me keep it nice and crisp. See my angle change ever so slightly. I'll change my hand and my arm so that I'm in the right position to tattoo in the direction that I need to. By working with a slightly lighter part of the needle, you'll see that it gives me a lighter effect. Even though I'm using a liner, you can see that just by grazing the skin, the taper of my needle has begun to sink into the skin, but I'm not at the right depth to be putting in a nice, bold, solid line. So what this does for me is it just kind of opens up the skin and it begins to put a bit of shading down. And rather than worrying about the right tone, this just gives me a chance to put a little bit of detail down, put it in the right place, and I can worry about the tone and finishing the saturation a little bit more later on, rather than worrying about getting all of that done right now. Sometimes when we see tattoos online, or even if you see them in person, if you're not sure the method that they were done with, you might, when you try to recreate something like that, you might rush too quick to try and put all of the details down, all of the things that amaze you in that tattoo. You might rush to try and do that first. But from my experience, a lot of the work is about building a foundation. And as I'm tattooing, my first layer is to be thoughtful of my shadows and my darkest parts. And with realism, you can see that I'll put in a really soft grey line. That's just so I don't lose my stencil and I don't lose my line. Realistically, I don't want it to heal like that because it would be very faded and it won't look very good. So I'm using my liner to open that skin up, put a little bit of tone in, and you can see that the line is becoming a bit more of a shadow than it is a line. And that's exactly what I intend to do, like over here and all around these petals in these creases. You can see that I'm trying to use my liner to create these nice sharp shadows that will replace my outlines. So the cool thing about the liner is that it begins to blur my lines and my shading. Just by changing my technique and my movement, I go from working with a liner to basically working with a shader. So earlier in the course, you saw me fold that piece of paper and really think about the bend and where the shadow starts to come into play based on how the paper was bending around. When I'm drawing and tattooing, I'm thinking about all of that type of stuff. I'm thinking about where does this rose petal begin to bend and how would that shadow fall on it based on the way that it's bending. You can see my shading. I either want it to come in this way or I'll cross hatch and I'll come in the other way. And in little things like this might be a time for me to begin thinking about putting in some little textures and details. Everything so far in here has been my 2/3 cap, and some of this shading over here is my 12 drop. So when we look at a petal and we start to become a little bit overwhelmed or unsure about the shading, why the shading is a particular way, understanding our different shadows is going to help a lot. We can see that this one shadow is because this part of the rose is almost like a cup that's bending down and going underneath the rose, catching all of that shadow. And then this shadow is here because of this petal on top of this one. It's made a cast shadow here. And then this shadow here is because this bottom petal is folded around. So you're dealing with 3 different shadows that are there for 3 different reasons. And if you don't understand how to break that down in your reference picture, or when you're drawing or when you're tattooing, it's going to be easy to overcomplicate and to make things look messy because you can't break it down in its simplest forms. So the reason that I'm using my darker tones is obviously because everything that I'm doing with my first pass, everything is all about my shadows and my darker tones. So naturally, because I use my darker tones for my shadows, those are the only tones that I need to focus on. On the tip of my needle, you'll be able to see some tissue, maybe little bits of fake skin. We don't want that on the end of our needle. So rather than touching the cartridge in the parts that are going to go back into the machine, I'm going to make sure that I get a brand new needle, because the dirt on the end of my needle is going to affect how the needle goes into the skin and how it puts the needle into the skin. So I would take my gloves off, I'd get myself a new needle, and then I can put some new gloves on to set my needle up and put it into my machine. So I'm using my black here for this part of the tattoo. As we hit our different depths, you hear how the machine and needle is adapting to your different depth. You'll hear the machine and needle begin to do a little bit more work. And the black and my darkest tones are so important at keeping the structure of the tattoo. I know I've said it before, but we're not relying on an outline. And for us to get a really nice healing tattoo, we have to make sure that there's good structure to the tattoo. So at this point, I'm basically using my liner to put in a line, because this is a really strong dark shadow that I want underneath this part of the rose. When we're working with realism and we're working with this kind of control in our needle, you really feel how the tiniest change in depth of the needle is going to give you a different result. You see me moving in the direction of the line that I'm working up to. I don't want to do this too much and come up to my line and risk going over it. So I can help myself by just working in the same direction. Again, I'll work with the very tip of my needle, barely letting it sink down into the skin. Now, as much as putting a really soft line in isn't going to heal well as a nice tattoo, being able to have that level of control is something that we're going to want. Going to dip in my water and dilute some of that, that two-third cap of black. And now I'm going to dip into my medium tone again. So like I was saying with the paper earlier, how we can begin to fold a piece of the paper over and give a reason to create a shadow. So Just like over here, if I want some of this petal to fold away, I can just put a little shadow there and give the illusion that this part of the petal has been folded over. And as much as I'm using my liner first, I've been tattooed by artists that work with their shader first, and then they use their liner to tighten everything up afterwards at the end. From my experience, it's quite clear that both ways work. It completely depends on what your preference is, and that if you're going to use a particular method, that we do it right. So if you decide that you want to use your shader first, make sure you're not going shading over the lines, because otherwise trying to neaten it up at the line, if you've gone over the line, there's no point in trying to neaten it up if you've gone over the line. I'm still constantly thinking about very tip of my needle, push down to the point, desired depth, and sweeping back out. Before I tattoo every stroke, I'm thinking about the shape of each petal, where's the light coming from, how would it hit, making sure that everything that I'm about to tattoo, I feel super confident that it's going to get me the results that I want. And this is another reason why I think drawing is so important, because it's my drawing experience that helps give me the understanding of what I want. That drawing helps me understand where my shading goes and why. Now, before I move too far along, I think I'm going to start doing some of this leaf. So as I come to the end of the stipple shading for my realism, you can see that the intention of my process is very different, even though it's basically the same rows. It's a lot softer. I've had to rely on the contrast, the darker areas, to really maintain the structure of the rose so that it doesn't fade and we don't lose important detail later on. But you can see that I haven't relied on any harsh outlines. I'm relying on the negative skin, and I'm relying on my different tones and putting my shading in the right place to rely on giving myself a more realistic look. And now that I'm done with my first layer, with my stipple shading, all that's left for me to do is to get my mags. I've got a 9 mag and a 15 mag, both in 12 gauge long taper. And my mags, now that all of my shading's in the right place, my shadows are in the right place, all I need to do is saturate and finish off the saturation and the shadows, and making sure that my tones are correct. With my 15 mag, I'm still on 3.9 for the stroke. I'm going to start at 7.5 for the voltage, and I'm going to see how it works on the skin. I've got the freedom to turn it up or down if I need to, depending on how the results I'm getting, how they look. So I'm dipping into my lightest tone, and I'm going to begin to carve out the area that I want to just be a highlight. Again, I'm mixing my technique, thinking about the tip of my needle down to the biting point, thinking about consistent hand speed, consistent application. And I'm mixing that with my art. I'm thinking about where I want that highlight to be. And now it's a case of just carving that out. You can tell that every stroke back and forth, I'm thinking about my coordination, the tip of my needle down to the biting point, making sure that I'm hitting the right depth, good consistent hand speed so that all of the shading looks nice and smooth. And at this point, if we worked too deep, the needle marks would be too strong and too messy. We'd be doing too much damage where we couldn't build over and give it multiple passes. And those multiple passes, it helps us take our time, it helps us put things in the right place, it helps with our precision. I'm trying to tackle all the different areas that I think would be touched by my lightest tone, just so that I can give myself a nice method to work with, rather than chopping and changing between loads of tones. Being able to break things down like this, it gives me a nice clean method to work with. Now I like how much skin is in it. I don't want to take up too much more skin. I like how much is breathing. So all that's left for me to do is just use my lightest tone to kind of saturate and smooth things out. A lot of my darker tones, because they're well layered, and I've layered them, I've gone over them, they're already quite well saturated, so they might not need as many passes and as much attention as some of these lighter areas might. Now I can move up to my 8 drop. Now I can move to my next darkest tone. And working this way, for me, it's always been a method of basically putting the shadows in the right place and then worrying about the tone afterwards, rather than overcomplicating everything and becoming overwhelmed. This method for me always helped me put things in the right place and then worry about the tone after. And it's just a much more satisfying method. Working with a method like that allows us to make us feel like we're in control. When I'm doing this, I'm not really working with, you can see I'm not working with the same method as when I'm doing black, but I'm working with a very similar depth. Like every time I know my needle comes in and out of the skin, but every time that it sinks down and I tattoo, I want to hit a pretty similar depth to black, so that I know that I'm sat in a good layer of skin. If I'm working too light, then this is all going to fade back too much, and I don't want that. Now I'm moving on to my 12, my medium drop. I want to make sure that some of these shadows are nice and strong. And because the skin has already been saturated and touched, it's not going to take a lot of work for me to finish off that saturation with my darker tone. And something that is important to remember, regardless of what style that you're doing, using the correct tone and saturating it the right way is really important. For some of these darker areas, I can't just use a lighter tone and work it in more and expect it to just become a darker tone. Like I can take one of these lighter tones, and I can make it look dark on the day just by working it in really well, saturating it, even going deeper. There's some things I can do to make my lighter tones look darker on the day. The problem is once they heal, their true tone starts to come out. So I can make my lightest tone look like a medium tone, on the day. If I took my light tone, did a bit of shading and made it look good, then I took the same light tone, but worked it in so it looks really dark. When they both hill back, the one that I've worked in more is going to be a little bit darker because it's more saturated, but it's not going to hill as dark as what it looks on the day. It's going to lighten up a lot. So it's very important that if we want to use a medium tone in here, if we want it to hill as a medium tone, it's important to actually use the medium tone and not just oversaturate a light tone until it looks dark. Because once it hills back, those true values are going to come back. And again, as I said before, even though these areas are done with my liner, some of the darker areas are really well saturated because of how many times I've gone over them. And I want to use my medium tone just to kind of saturate and make it fully saturated and smoothed out a little bit more. Using my 15 mag, 10 gauge 15 mag and my medium tone. Most of the time, I'll try to keep my needles nice and flat and parallel to the skin so that I can get my nice smooth shading. But when I'm working up to an edge, I will tilt my needle on the side and use that edge to my advantage. Very similar to how I did my grey lines. I'm not working to my full depth. I'm just letting the needle break the skin a little bit, just so I can figure out exactly where my needle is. The tip of my needle is where I think it is. I'm just opening the skin, putting a first little tone down, and gradually building up. And all I'm going to do to finish is I'm going to use my 12, that medium drop, and I'm going to use that just to help pop out some of these petals at the back that need a little bit of contrast, just to help pop them out a little bit. So now you've seen me tattoo both of those roses. Very similar techniques, very similar way of building them up. Just the tools that I've used and the way that I've used them. I'm not using solid outlines on this one, but focusing more on my pendulum shading and using my contrast to maintain my structure. But in terms of thinking about my shapes, my shadows, my tones, creating a method to work by for me to follow. Hopefully you've seen how they're very similar, and you can now take the information that I've told you, figure out how to pick a machine and do whatever you need to do to get the results that you want to in your tattooing. Don't forget that if you're stuck at any point on tattooing and something isn't making sense to you, there's a group in the online course for you to shoot a message over, send a message, let me know whatever it is that you're dealing with that you want to fix, and hopefully we can help you get through it.